All right, welcome everyone to this webinar on practical considerations for AI in the legal writing classroom. We're really excited that we have so many folks in attendance, and we know that this is a topic that you probably have seen just a deluge of information on. There's so much information coming out about generative AI and what that means for law practice, what that means for teaching. And really, when we thought about putting together this webinar, it was from a place of kind of being overwhelmed. There are just so many resources out there, so many different opinions, different options for engaging with AI, generative AI, et cetera. And so we put this together so that hopefully going away from this, you have both a better understanding of what generative AI is and different types of AI kind of more generally. And then also you have some concrete ideas of one, what you might do in your classroom, two, why you might be doing it, and then three, and maybe most helpfully, ways that you yourself could use that AI to help you in preparation for your classes. So we really wanted this to be a practical application of AI skills as opposed to a theoretical discussion of the positives and negatives of AI. We know those discussions will also be happening. So we think that by engaging in and taking a look at these tools in this webinar, and then hopefully on your own afterwards, you'll have a better sense of the types of arguments that you may want to make in those conversations, or where you fall with in those conversations. And a little bit of what you're seeing in the polling is kind of trying to get at, like, how comfortable are you with it, and what are you thinking in terms of how AI, specifically generative AI, is going to impact your teaching, law practice, etc. So go ahead and answer those questions, and I am going to introduce our wonderful speakers. And I will go ahead and just introduce all four of you right now so that we can jump in and just let you do your presentations. But first we have Sean Harrington, who is at ASU. He is the Law and Technology Librarian. I'm not going to read his entire, the little bio that's on the screen that you can all see, but I just want to tell you that I've had the pleasure of working with Sean on different projects. And when we thought about putting together this webinar, he was the first person that came to mind in terms of expertise, because he just knows a lot about the tools. He's played with a lot of them, and he's going to share about that with you in his presentation, which is really exciting. And I think you'll all benefit from the knowledge he has to share about that. Next up, we will have Ashley Binetti Armstrong, who's at the University of Connecticut Law School. And Ashley jumped in right away and wrote an article. I will post the link to it on SSRN so that you can see that abstract. But she was in the kind of fray of what should we do with AI and legal writing kind of right at the beginning. And I think that you will also hear not only about kind of what she's doing, but also some of the ethical considerations that go along with using it in her presentation as well. Then we will have Sue Chesler, who is at ASU, where she is a clinical professor of law, teaching legal writing and skills courses. And Sue is going to give you a very practical application of using AI in the classroom and talking through kind of what that looks like and what the students might be experiencing as they use it, and what she's seen in creating that exercise for the classroom. But I don't know, I hope I'm not betraying any confidences here. I don't think I am, but I will tell you that I think Sue probably comes on board not as the person that's like, I want to know everything about generative AI and I want to be using all the tools, but as someone who's like, let me see what these are and what they might mean, but is maybe a little less enthusiastic. I think we said enthusiastic but terrified in the description of her approach to AI. So this is just mostly to let you know, if you're in the same boat, you know it's a good boat to be in, because some of us are definitely there. And then we are going to close out with Tracy Norton, who's at LSU, where she is the Erick Vincent Anderson Professor and an Associate Professor of Professional Practice. And for those of you who are on the legal writing listserv, you probably know that Tracy has also kind of embraced a lot of these AI tools, not only for the classroom, but also as someone who has to get ready for classes, as someone who has to do other work. Because I think one of the real concerns that we have is the amount of time it takes to incorporate these new tools and to learn about them and to think about how we're going to use them. So she is going to share her expertise and experience in those in using those tools, as well as kind of overview of what to consider and think about in using the tools yourself. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen so that we can start. I'm going to end the poll. It looks like most folks have had a chance to participate, and I'm going to share those results with everybody so that you can just see them. I will, stop sharing those in a little bit here, but I thought you might be interested to see those results.
Where are my other 6 people that are subscribing to more than one of these things? I'm running out of budget on a monthly basis to subscribe to all these apps. I want to know how we're going to solve this issue.
All right, take it away, Sean.
I would love to. So I'm Sean Harrington, Law and Tech Librarian here at Arizona State University. Can you see my slides okay? Yeah, okay. So that's me. Here's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to pirouette sort of around the thorny legal issues and ethics associated with this, because we have a professor, Ashley Armstrong, who's going to talk about that and give it a much better explanation. For the most part, I'm just going to assume that you want to know how to use these models, and you also want to know how your students could be using these things, because I talk to a lot of students about how they're using them. There are lots of terms being thrown around on this topic, and so I kind of stay away from the term AI just because it's become so ubiquitous and pervasive that it doesn't seem to be very meaningful anymore. And an important thing to note, if you look at this slide, is the little portion that we're going to focus on is just this little tiny aspect called LLMs, large language models. It has a crossover with generative AI. So you can use it for generative AI stuff too. But I'm going to talk about them in the context of the LLMs mostly because that's how they apply to the law. So in general, I'm going to break this down into 2 steps. The first step is training the model on a huge pile of data. And then the second step is reinforcement learning from human feedback. Now, when I say pre-train the model on a huge amount of data, I mean huge. It is an overwhelming amount of data and so much that it is hard to conceptualize. For example, the Common Crawl is a pile of data that has over 50 billion web pages, and it gets updated monthly. So we're talking about data sets that are just really hard to even wrap your head around, and that's what they're training these data sets on. So how does one of these large language models learn things like languages when it's going through these data sets, tokens, and transformers? So tokens are a way to break up large chunks of text strings down to chunks for analysis. Tokens can be the basic unit of text or code for an LLM. They can also be in reference sometimes to what you're paying on these LLMs, how much you're going to pay to have to use the LLM, the API for it generally. But it can be anything from a single character up to multiple words or even sentences. It just depends on the LLM and how they choose to categorize their tokens. OpenAI has their own tokenizer. So you can view whatever, however many tokens it would take for your request. If you are interested, you get it. And generally they'll tell you, because the number of tokens in the context of these databases, these LLMs, will tell you how much context the engine can take in before it spits out a result for you and how big the result can be when it spits it out. This is really important because it's a huge selling point for all of these models. So once we've got all our data tokenized and categorized by position, now it's fed into a neural network, and that neural network begins to learn patterns inside the data. And this is how it starts to learn things like languages. So this is what a simple neural network looks like. You have your input layer, you have an hidden layer for analysis and categorization, and then output, what you see in the chat, in ChatGPT. We're not dealing with simple neural networks. When we're dealing with something like ChatGPT, we're dealing with complex neural networks that use things called transformers. Transformers are so huge and so overwhelming to think about in the types of computations that they're doing and on such a scale that you could do several webinars just about the topic of transformers. For your purposes, what you need to know is that transformers are a sophisticated way to measure complex relationships between large piles of data. And I'm happy to send you, if you want, I have a list of like videos on YouTube. If you want to see how a transformer works, I'm happy to do that. This slide is just for the nerds in the audience who actually understand transformers, so they know that I'm paying attention. There are a few things that make transformers unique among neural networks, and these are two of them. Relationships are generated between all the data points present, then given different weights. This is only possible because of modern technology. And many of those complex models require renting GPU clusters and cloud computing. Changing even a single character can change the output of the model. While this feat of programming is absolutely incredible, it also means that the output can be kind of unpredictable. Famously, Sam Altman of OpenAI stated that nobody at OpenAI could predict the output. It's simply unfeasible with the number of variables present and the ever-changing nature of these models. Now, I think will become more clear. At the end of this process, you train it on a pile of data, and then it recognizes these patterns. The model becomes really good at predicting what token will become next. And that's basically how it functions. That's why you've heard people compare these technologies to the autofill technology on your cell phone. It's also why the model, by giving the model more context, makes it better at predicting what you need. If you give it a lot to work with, it's narrowing the model and giving it an idea of what type of text you want it to predict. I won't read on the text on all of my slides because I have a lot of text on my slides. I break that cardinal rule. But this is a kind of interesting illustration. All I put was, why did the chicken cross the? I didn't tell it what I wanted. I didn't tell it what I expected as far as output. And so it filled in road, of course. But then it also filled in, this is the classic answer to a joke. Essentially, it filled in a lot of input that I was not particularly interested in. And so remember, when you're using these models, all it's doing is trying to predict what somebody who is putting in your text would want in return next. This is also how the model gets biases. Have you ever seen on Reddit a biased, ignorant, stupid comment that you wanted to hit the downvote button really fast for? That's in the model. It's being replicated by these models. There is no thinking going on, only parroting back predicted text based on this huge amount of data, which can be really frustrating to some people. So that's the first step. Now we're on to step 2, reinforcement learning from human feedback. So we have our data trained. Now we need to give it feedback to cure it from deficiencies that robots might not figure out on their own. And this can be done on a question by question hand curation basis, or by algorithms that comb through tons of responses at once and make changes. And I think that'll be clear with some of the examples. So this is the manual input. A lot of these models are actually crowdsourcing the reinforcement, or RLHF, from you while you're using these things. So you've probably seen a little thumbs up, thumbs down on the model. This is them saying, what do you think of this feedback? And if it's bad, then they take a look at it and maybe change the model. This is also another one of the reasons it can be really difficult to predict the output of the models, because they're changing constantly based on crowdsourced input in certain cases. This is machine feedback. So this is when they go, this is generally the owner of the model, the company, whatever, that owns the model, and they're trying to make the model more user-friendly to comply with things like laws and regulations, or to give people a better user experience. The difficulty here is that people are I'm sure you've seen prompts on Twitter and in news articles about people hacking this thing. People are very clever at getting the model to say bad things. And so this is a very thorny task, can be very difficult to implement. And so let's take a pause to let our brains cool down. But that is the basics of how these models work. That's the engine behind them. And now we talk about the fun part of the presentation, which is how tips for using them and how they're being deployed. So first things first is ChatGPT is not the only one of these things. I try to be aware people are coming to this with different levels of knowledge and interest in this topic. So there are all kinds of different models out there being developed. Google obviously has a model as well. Anthropic is one that has produced Claude Plus that has garnered a lot of attention. There's services like Poe. I have a screenshot of it here. Whoops. I have a screenshot of it here, and they bundle several of these models together so that you can try different ones. Always remember that a custom bot, one that is specifically made for your needs or your industry, is going to be substantially superior to something like ChatGPT. Most people are simply using ChatGPT because it's simple and user-friendly, and they're intimidated by other options. And it was the first one that all their friends are talking about. But there's other things out there that may be better for whatever you're doing. And that brings us to my first tip for usage of these models, any of them. My first tip for usage is you are not implementing a search query. You are having a conversation with a robot sidekick. And if you approach it in that sort of frame of mind, I think you'll be a lot less frustrated by the output that it gives you. So this is for my law librarian friends who I know. I saw Kenton on here. I saw Beth on here, Tara, all my friends here. Hi, it's good to see all of you. This is for my law librarian friends, because what we are used to doing is putting precise inputs with Boolean expressions into a search query so that we can know what we're going to get back, precise outputs. That is not this. With this, remember, we're talking about context in the context of tokens and the massive context that these models can take in. So by providing, you can narrow down the model by providing additional context. You think of this similar to using filters on the back end in like Lexis or Westlaw. You're saying focus more on data that has these types of patterns. Narrow the model down to stuff that is useful to me specifically. Generally, the more context you give it, the better the output. You can see here, I tell it, I don't just ask, what's the Chevron doctrine? I say, you're a law professor. Pretend you put on your little law professor hat at a top United States school. So that's narrowing the pool of information down to stuff that has those patterns in it. Also, don't give up immediately. I'm sure most of you have dealt with situations where the first thing that comes back is not particularly useful. By continuing the conversation, you're just feeding it more context and nudging the model in a direction that will be way more useful to you. And also be very specific about the output that you want. Remember, my little chicken, did the chicken cross the road example, it gave me way too much stuff that was completely irrelevant to me. You can say things like, summarize that output, make it only 3 sentences each. It's also really flexible. And this is probably one of the things that you've seen people use a lot in Twitter and on, shared among friends and newsletters and stuff, is getting it to sing sea shanties, getting it to do HTML output. I would also like to point out in the second one there, I said, code that into the body of an HTML web page and provide a header that summarizes it. It did that. It made up its own header, the Chevron doctrine sea shanty, harder to say than I thought. And this, you can cut and paste this into something that will display HTML. It is a full and complete web page. So it's very flexible with its output. Think big and don't get frustrated if you don't get the right thing back on the first response. And what we have just learned together in those last 4 or 5 slides is everything you would learn, not everything, it's the very basics of what you would learn if you go to YouTube and look into prompt engineering, prompt hacking, ChatGPT prompting. That's what they're doing, is there different ways of giving the model context. Watching a 5 to 10 minute video of one of these that's specific to whatever you're doing can be exceptionally useful, or just one overall in general. They also have entire guides to these. So a lot of the information, zero-shot prompting, we're going over this type of stuff, but you can take an entire class on this now. It is a quote unquote science that people are really getting into. So I think this is a good time to talk about hallucinations. I had a student, I have time because I'm talking so fast. So I had alumni, it wasn't even a student, it was an alumni, 3 years out of law school. So I've been practicing for a while. And they called me and they said, hey, Sean, I found this case. It's Jones v. Smith or whatever. It's in the Pacific Reporter, 32nd edition. I'm like, really? I'm like, so I looked it up on Westlaw. I'm like, I don't see it in the Pacific Reporter. You know where this is going already because we're talking about this stuff. And I had to go all the way out to the law library and pull one of the Pacific Reporters off the shelf, take a picture of it, like, look, man, it's not in there. And then it finally occurred to me, this was very early, this is like in February or something. I said, wait a minute, are you using ChatGPT? He said, yeah, it's not a big deal. Hallucinations are a real thing. Prompt engineering is a great way to reduce these hallucinations and erroneous output, but a better way is through what's called context boundaries. This is a time-consuming and technical process that not all of these have. ChatGPT doesn't have it because it's a general purpose bot, but industry-specific or subject-specific LLMs would have it, where they would limit the, the Lex AI, for example, has this. It says something like, when the user is looking for cases, only look at this little narrow portion of the database to populate the information. Way more useful, but again, something that is pretty technical. And then I think another useful tip is just understanding how the technology works can really help you avoid frustration because you understand the limitations of it. So this is, a lot of people use ChatGPT to summarize articles. Something we read a lot of articles. I have a little plugin. I just hit it, summarize the article into bullet points. So with these nesting iterations of summaries, you're losing a lot of resolution. So it may be better to focus on the parts that you care more about and have them summarize that thing. The LLM doesn't necessarily know what an important part of an article is. You may read too much filler. You may not read enough of something that's actually the thesis of the article. So attention in transformers deals with some of these issues, but it's not perfect. And so knowing how this thing is working can be very helpful. Tip 3 is you've undoubtedly seen instances of ChatGPT giving output that will contradict itself in a matter of sentences. For example, I have asked it simple things like, what is today's date? And it'll answer wrong, and then all of a sudden it answers right. And it doesn't seem to have any knowledge of why it answered something wrong or right or what gave it that. Giving it instructions to go step by step can be very helpful because what it's essentially doing is taking the model's output and at each step it is feeding it back into the model. So it's much less likely to contradict itself. Some prompters online in that guide that I pointed you to, they found that out. And so using it, especially for complicated topics and mathematical equations, can be exceptionally useful. The step, just putting, let's take this step by step, literally at the end, makes the models better. Now we get to talk about my favorite part. By the way, I made all these pictures with Adobe Firefly and MS Designer, which you get for free if you have a Creative Cloud account or a Microsoft account. I also use Night Cafe and Midjourney. We have to pay for those. And I am terrible at anything design or art related. You can ask my wife. And yet I am able to put together some pretty decent artwork, I think, on this thing. It's not Picasso, but it's good. Okay, so this is my favorite aspects of these new models, is how we can use them for the practice of law in the classroom. I think one of the greatest ones is accessibility for ADA students and international students specifically. There are prompts like rewrite that so it's easier for somebody with dyslexia to read. It can read things in real time. It can transcribe. There are apps that will transcribe in real time. I imagine that a lot of students are going to want to record your class sessions, specifically the audio now, because they can very easily take that and incorporate it into their notes in these types of models. It also does a great job of translating. This is application number 2. It also does a great job of translating from human to robot. I mean, if you think about it, that's really what it's doing behind the scenes when you're talking to it with language. So Excel functions, code snippets, websites, programs, it's already doing this stuff and it's really good at it for the most part. A new application has been online searching. This has really shaken up the landscape in many ways because LLMs sort of circumvent the traditional boost with keywords type searches that Google was sort of Google's bread and butter. The other thing is Microsoft very early on partnered with OpenAI. And so they got the jump on Google. Google's Bard is still in beta somehow. And so a lot of people are using Bing. In general, Bing is a great place to start if you're a newcomer to this technology. Microsoft has been working directly with them. They're also rolling out this technology on many of their MS Suite products with their Copilot. That's what the Thomson Reuters announcement was today. For us, I would say a lot of us are probably at government institutions or large enterprise accounts. We will not see those types of changes immediately. So using the web version of these apps frequently allows you to have immediate access to them when they drop, because usually they'll version lock your version of MS Word or whatever for security purposes, or limit certain features on enterprise accounts because they're worried about things like student data. But using it on the web, usually you can circumvent that stuff. And even since I made this slide, Google has rolled that out on their like Google Docs platform, Excel, Google Sheets. I haven't had much success with it, but apparently you can use it. Why Bing? Most importantly, it allows you to check the source of your information. So when you type something into ChatGPT, unless you have certain plugins enabled, it just gives you the prompt, the generative AI. It doesn't give you sources that you can click on and go check it. So this is me typing in on my Bing account, find me 5 news articles from 2023 that thoroughly analyze AI legal research. And here, Brookings Institute, New York Times, law.com, reliable sources, but I can actually click in and go check those out, which is very, very useful. So another really useful tool is something like Chat PDF. It doesn't have to be Chat PDF. I've asked it to summarize historical events that I'm ignorant about, restate things. It's just a wonderful tool. You're having a conversation with a PDF as you're using it. And then this is one of the biggest paradigm shifters that I think is going, paradigm shifters, I can't believe I said that, but big changes that's going to happen to law and law schools is being able to make your own personal chatbot. This is something that previously was very difficult to do potentially, but now you have lots of options. You can subscribe to these monthly platforms. And most importantly, this is going to be very attractive for law students because it's going to allow them to input notes, study aids, books, and interact with all of that information in one big pile. If they upload a textbook, some study aids from your course, can you imagine the different things that they could do summarizing and restating it? But it can get very technical very fast at the higher ends. You have to know you have to learn to code on some level right now, but it's not always going to be like that. In general, it's pretty easy to make it's pretty easy to create an LLM chatbot. It's difficult to create a good one. The prepackaged models will be good enough for many people, but they won't have sophisticated things like context barriers in many cases, or it'll be expensive to get those. This is the next level of making your own chatbot, which is making an auto GPT. If you're willing to pay or have a background in APIs, you could tell a chatbot what to do, and then it will tell other programs what to do. Or you have a program that tells the chatbot what to do. Hey, Zapier, go to Outlook, write this email, ChatGPT writes the email for you. I was talking to a guy who's automated about 50% of his email responses just by doing this. This is just kind of a summary of what we covered. And this is the most exciting part, which is legal research and the practice of law. Those of you who are old enough to remember the very controversial implementation of the search bar in Westlaw will be prepared for this sort of change. You can go back and find plenty of articles, I think, at that time that worried that this would impact the research and practice of law. We now kind of take it for granted. I think it did impact it, but the pluses outweighed the negatives to some degree. Just today, Westlaw announced that it's going to be integrated into Copilot, which is the AI platform on all Microsoft products, Word, Outlook, everything. Most likely, it seems like it's going to be added through the Microsoft Store. And that's exactly what Lexis did. Lexis made big news when it announced an LLM that is connected to Microsoft Teams. This means that they're working with OpenAI directly, so they have access to Microsoft engineers and OpenAI engineers and attorneys to curate the product. This is set to be the release by the end of the summer, but it's not going to be part of the law school subscription. It's going to be an extra additional subscription. I demoed it. It's fascinating. It will take all of your case file documents. It will run a search. It will suggest secondary sources and practical law notes, forms. It'll auto-populate those forms with stuff inside your case law documents. Just a really fascinating implementation of this type of technology. Casetext has also been making some big splashes in this industry because of this. Pablo Arredondo is famously very techy, and he was already using something kind of similar to this for his Kara AI. And he is also working directly with OpenAI, which is huge because then you have access to kind of the premier developers in this area, and it makes it a lot easier to do your development. I would say just demo it if you're interested in it. And even lots of old apps. There's new apps popping up, but there's also lots of old apps that are just implementing this as a matter of fact in their platforms. Grammarly, WordBreak, they've been around for a long time. I would like you to specifically pay attention to how, let's see, ClearBrief, this will rankle some legal writing professors. This is how they're advertising to students. Anybody can write legalese. Now, while that's not true, that's what students are going to see. And so I think you just doing 2 or 3 demos of this thing, these types of things can be enormously helpful. It's like 30 minutes. You have to deal with some salesmanship and some marketing, but you'll learn about how it works. And you'll also learn the massive limitations. There's also a great guide from the University of Arizona, our friends over at the University of Arizona, to this type of stuff that I always point people towards. And that's the end of my presentation. Generally, these bots are most useful to somebody who can already evaluate the information. They just speed up certain tedious tasks, finding the right practice guide, finding the right case, so that you can make a legally sophisticated decision. If you cannot evaluate the output, then they're not nearly as useful to you. These robots are not a replacement for you. They can't do what you do. They are a robot assistant to help you do what you do better. In any case, they are still very much in the prototype phase, require a lot of tinkering, can be frustrating to use. And we should always be wearing our skeptics hats whenever we're interacting with them, which is a great segue into Professor Ashley Armstrong, who is going to explain more about the ethical implications of using these models. I almost kept it under 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Sean. And it's
a
great transition because as I hear you present, I'm getting pumped and excited by.
I'm a tech optimist. I'm gonna make everyone talk about this.
And I'm a little bit worried that I'm going to be the downer in the room now because
no, they need that to moderate my optimism because there are serious problems with these things.
Right, I'm still very cautious, but don't worry. After I present, Sue and Tracy are going to bring back the optimism. So let me share my screen. Let's see, make sure it works. Okay, so I'm Ashley B. Armstrong. I teach legal practice at the University of Connecticut School of Law, and I'm very excited to be here and to talk to you a little bit about my journey with ChatGPT and generative AI and how I've been using ChatGPT and discussing ChatGPT in my legal writing classroom with my students this past spring. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen this helpful infographic, ChatGPT and the Dunning-Kruger effect. I think it's really illustrative of where many of us start out before we understand fully how generative AI works, and then where we end up once we start to play with the tech. So I started playing around with ChatGPT in late December, early January, and just fell into having day-long conversations for about a week, which was really disturbing to my husband and small child. But I asked it questions because I wanted to see how it would perform on legal research and writing tasks. So the questions related to problems that I taught in the classroom, because I figured that would be a good litmus test for me since I had some background in those various areas based on the prompts that I would use with my students for either memo writing or brief writing. And this is a snippet of some of what I asked, the prompts and the responses I received. This excerpt is up on SSRN. It's titled "Who's Afraid of ChatGPT?" And what I did was I tested it on Connecticut's recreational land use law, which isn't widely discussed on the internet. So when we're thinking about how ChatGPT works and what it has access to, as of right now, it doesn't have access to anything behind a paywall. So opinions and unreported opinions on Lexis or Westlaw, it doesn't have access to those. So if the questions you're asking rely on information that is on those legal research platforms, it can't give you the right answer because it's simply predicting what comes next in a string of text based on what it has been trained on, what it has access to. And like Sean mentioned, we see that Lexis is rolling out its own generative AI, now Westlaw as well, and that we remain to see if that's going to ameliorate all the issues. But when I tested ChatGPT and I asked it about Connecticut's recreational land use statute and I gave it a fact pattern, it produced responses that looked really wonderful. Case citations, told me little snippet summaries about the cases. And then what I quickly found when I went on Lexis and Westlaw to look up these cases, that no cases by those names existed, and the reporter that they provided linked to a completely different case. And in addition, when I asked it to apply the cases that it had made up to my fact pattern, it did that too. And it never said, hey, you might want to check, this is incorrect. So it did a whole host of behaviors that I found really interesting, making up cases, citing to cases that didn't exist, remembering the made up case that it provided earlier in the conversation, and then citing to it later in the conversation, applying facts from the made up cases that didn't exist to the client's facts. But it did write in a professional, lawyerly way, and it did do a pretty good job of summarizing facts that I provided to it. So all of this was happening, and I began to think about the ethical issues and how I should talk with my students about these ethical issues. And they were twofold. One branch of ethical issues stemmed from the inaccuracy that I was seeing. And again, specific to ChatGPT that doesn't have access to Lexis or Westlaw or dockets, et cetera, that it's making up cases. What knowledge does it have? And I started thinking about our duty of competence as attorneys, our duty to be diligent, to represent our clients zealously, duty as an advisor, candor to the tribunal. There's so many different ethical duties that are implicated when we're not ensuring our best that information that we're providing is accurate. And then I also began to think about client confidentiality. Rule 1.6, we have to protect our clients' confidences. So as I'm going through thinking about these different rules and how I could work with my students, I thought it'd be interesting to task them with learning by doing, which is always one of the most effective ways to teach adult learners. And I created an assignment where I asked them to test out ChatGPT for themselves, and then to look up the different aspects of the model rules that I thought were implicated, to summarize them, and to think about how they came into play when they analyzed the outputs that ChatGPT provided. Now, if you have ethical concerns about requiring your students to use ChatGPT because of student data privacy issues, or because of requiring them to be complicit in training the AI, you could always provide them with prompt and response. So I could provide them with the raw data that I had, and it would still be beneficial to work through the same set of questions. So I did this with my students in my class, and then I took it a step further, and I thought for a client letter assignment that we had coming down the pipeline, in the spring semester, we were working with a client who was charged with violating Title VII workplace discrimination. And they had interviewed that client, and now it was time to write the client a letter discussing their options, their liability, the law. And I made this optional. For this one assignment, I told the students who were working in groups that they could use ChatGPT to help them in any way they saw fit. I just wanted them at the very end of the assignment to include a little paragraph telling me how they used it and how they found it. So then I developed my own observations after reviewing that work. And we also talked about their observations as well. And one thing that came up was students would note either that they didn't use it because they felt more comfortable just relying on their own skills, or if they did use it, I had quite a few students who said, it took me a lot longer, I think, than just doing the work initially. Maybe that's because I'm not good at prompt engineering yet, but I found that I was fact checking every single thing that ChatGPT was telling me, as they should. Another observation I had, though, even though I did see students saying that they were fact checking, part of this law is really complicated, understanding the difference between pretext and mixed motive. And many of the client letters that relied on ChatGPT just simply got that aspect of the law wrong. So there were parts of these letters loaded with inaccuracies, and it provided for a really rich conversation among the students. Something else that came up in the conversation that I thought was interesting was not just the idea that ChatGPT works by predicting the next word in text, so it could theoretically plagiarize existing text in the wild, and plagiarism in and of itself is not good. But if you are an attorney who's using ChatGPT and not checking, and it does end up lifting text from somewhere, that could negatively affect your reputation with your client who's entrusting you and paying you to do this work, to do this analysis. And then if they were to find out that, okay, I could have just found this online anyways on my own. So reputational risks came up in the conversation. I will say that the students observed some nice aspects of working with ChatGPT, like dealing with blank page, trauma, and writer's block. Some noted that it just helped them get started with words on a page, even if the words weren't always the most helpful. Some noted that it started them off with a workable basic framework from which to continue writing. That the language was accessible, and they thought that was really great, especially considering that this was being written for a client. So the students were on the fence, and they noted it was unclear if the hassle of the additional work was worth the ChatGPT output. And I think they were most impressed by ChatGPT's accuracy in spelling and grammar, that the language sounded professional. One thing that I try, well, a few things that I try to speak to when I'm teaching legal writing, and when I think about some of the concerns that people raise with is ChatGPT, is generative AI going to replace attorneys? I think in terms of writing clarifies thought, and that's something that generative AI is not going to be capable of. We often find ourselves writing essays, law journal articles, memos, briefs, and as we're writing, the act of writing helps us think more deeply about the subject and helps us reach conclusions that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten to without going through that iterative process. Another thing that we do as attorneys is we bring order to chaos. That's something that we're constantly thinking of, and we talk to our students about. Think about the reader, the end user. When we write comments to our students, we're trying to dramatize the presence of a reader. Can ChatGPT overtake that task and bring order to chaos in a way that a writer, a human writer, can bring order to chaos when they're thinking about a specific reader on the other end? I'm not sure. I think there's a lot to be said about ChatGPT being in its infancy, and we have yet to see how far the tech can take us, and it's developing rapidly. But right now, as it stands, I don't think it's capable of reproducing human intelligence and creativity. So we still have a lot of value to bring. And part of our mission then is to ensure that our students understand both how to use these tools effectively and ethically, and also therefore the limitations. This last bullet point, I also like to raise with my students in terms of what is our mission as lawyers? Do we always write to reaffirm the status quo? Yes, we are working based off precedent, based off the common law, and that does have an effect of sometimes reaffirming the status quo. But if we're really seeking to move the needle and write as a tool for social justice, then the way that ChatGPT works, where it's predicting the next word that comes in a string of words, that's not going to necessarily help us move the needle and best represent our clients. In addition to evaluating ChatGPT, evaluate all the advice you receive, everything you read about generative AI. And here's one example. This is an infographic that's really pretty, and I found it on Lexis recently. And one of the 5 key considerations it gives is trust but verify. And I would overhaul that and say proceed with caution. Don't let trust be the initial starting point. Proceed with caution and then verify. And another part that I pull out is it said generative AI apps are known to sometimes produce misinformation. And that's not true. If you are asking generative AI questions about material that is simply not within its corpus, that it hasn't been trained on, it's going to often provide incorrect information and make it look like it is correct. To that point, and in terms of verifying, including what people say about generative AI, there was an article that recently came out And it said, just teach your students that they can prompt ChatGPT to not fabricate court cases. And the prompt that was suggested in this article was, you ask a question and you say to ChatGPT, refer to relevant court cases, do not fabricate court cases. And I did that with my recreational land use problem. And sure enough, it produced what you see on the left, this 2-paragraph overview of what constitutes a fee under this statute. And it cited 2 cases. And I could tell you those cases don't exist. And then I thought, let me give ChatGPT one more chance. ChatGPT, did you lie to me? Did you fabricate cases when I asked you not to? And then ChatGPT says, I'm real sorry. Yeah, I did. I actually have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to telling you cases. So in that sense, there's not only misinformation that ChatGPT can produce itself, but there's misinformation circulating about how ChatGPT works and what effective prompt engineering might look like. 2 final things. I do want to flag what I think are going to be durable skills. Our students are still going to need to learn how to do everything that's required for effective legal research and writing and analysis. Why? Both to form useful prompts so that they could actually use the tech, and then also to be competent and ethical when they're assessing generative AI's output. And if we think about durable learning objectives, because again, we're in generative AI's infancy, the tech is going to continue developing. We've seen it develop very quickly. Some durable learning objectives are to make sure we're encouraging students to understand how the different tech works and to become conversant in how to leverage the tech, to appreciate and understand its pitfalls, and then always to connect this back to our professional responsibility to our clients, to make sure that we are ethically and effectively representing the interests of the people we work for. And I think those are the learning objectives that are going to transcend. And to Sean's point about the search bar in the on Westlaw, if you read any of the articles on that, if you read articles on when cloud computing was coming into the foray, when brief analysis tools were being piloted by Lexis and Westlaw, I feel like you could take those words and swap out brief analysis tool or swap out cloud computing and then swap in generative AI, and you'll have the reasonable concerns that are permeating through our discussions right now. So that's to say that generative AI tools, they're not a substitute for critical legal thinking. And if anything, it's a call to action for us to help our students see that they need to be ever more vigilant about how they're critically evaluating and thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. There's some questions, we'll save them for the end, but there's some questions about some ethical concerns that I think will make for good discussion. So next up is Sue.
Hello, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let me just get started. So I am going to talk about using generative AI in my upper level contract drafting class. So Kim was right when she said in the beginning that I am not the tech savvy presenter today. I use technology because I think it's necessary, and I feel the need to teach my students what they need to know in order to practice law in today. But I am definitely not the Sean or the Tracy who is spending all my free time looking up generative AI and how to do it. What I want to talk to you today about, I want to answer these 4 questions. Why do I introduce generative AI to my contract drafting students? What are the learning objectives of the exercise I have created, how it works, and how this exercise can be adapted for other courses. So first off, contract drafting, I think, is very different than other types of legal writing with respect to using generative AI for a couple of reasons. Unlike traditional litigation-based legal writing, contract drafting is expected to start from a precedent document, right? No one thinks a lawyer opens a blank document and just starts drafting a contract, unlike a brief, where there's issues of plagiarism for copying precedent documents. That doesn't exist at all in contract drafting. In fact, one of the main skills I think I teach my students is how to effectively use those form and model agreements, how to find them and how to use them, and how to use them as a starting point to draft an effective contract for their clients. There's also less concerns about the hallucinations and the wrong answers with contract drafting, because there isn't a right. It's not as if when a student is looking for generative AI to help them with a starting point for a particular contract clause or a particular type of contract, there isn't the fear that that AI will make up the answer, because there are answers all over Google. You don't need access to Westlaw or Lexis or Bloomberg, although that may be helpful down the road. It's not the same kind of concern about having wrong answers. And I think for contract drafting, AI has been used a lot already. You could get on Bloomberg's draft analyzer and students can input the contract they wrote for my class, and Bloomberg's draft analyzer will analyze it for them and give them some feedback on what they did well and what they didn't do well. And that's just not that far off from using ChatGPT. So I decided to create this exercise, and here was my learning objectives. First off, to develop an understanding of how generative AI can be used in the drafting process, to give them some chance to practice using it, to evaluate and understand the strengths and weaknesses associated with using ChatGPT versus the more traditional ways in which we find model agreements, Bloomberg, Westlaw, Lexis, or even Google, and also to understand the limitations of using it and recognizing when one method may be better than the other. I also had a secret teaching objective, which was to try to alleviate some fears about generative AI replacing transactional drafters. I think the fear of generative AI replacing contract drafters or other types of transactional drafters is even greater than the idea that it can replace a brief writer, because transactional draft is seen as a less creative activity. I think people think, well, of course we can just get on and someone can just spit out an employment agreement for us or a lease agreement, and you don't really need to do much thinking. I disagree with that entirely. And so I really wanted to show my students who are interested in transactional drafting that that's not the case. The exercise I'm about to walk through with you, it is easily adaptable to any kind of legal writing that starts with a model document. So that can be litigation-based even, if you teach your students how to draft complaints or jury instructions. But I also think you can adapt this exercise to more traditional case law research prompts. It just comes with more of the potential ethical concerns. For this exercise, I have my students use ChatGPT for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's free. There are some more specific generative AIs that are used for contract drafting, for example, Spellbook. However, and it's free, but I am almost number 38,000 on the wait list to get access. So I didn't think that was very practical. There are some that are also very expensive, like CoCounsel, which costs, I think, several hundreds of dollars. They will give you a free trial, but I'm also on the wait list to get the free trial. So to be realistic and practical, I have my students use free and easy to get to ChatGPT. So here's the basic prompt for the exercise. I have the students work in groups of 3 to 4 students, and I assign each group to either use ChatGPT or to use traditional research tools, Bloomberg, Westlaw, etc., to draft a particular contract term. I do tell them upfront, regardless of which method they're using, they're likely going to have to revise the result to follow the best practices, effective drafting techniques I teach them in my class. And then I ask them after they get the result to answer a series of questions. Now, here is the whole factual prompt that I give my students. You definitely do not need to read it. The bottom line is I ask them to use whatever source they've been assigned to draft a very particular clause. It is an ESG clause, environmental, social, and governance clause, to be included in an employment agreement. And I decided to use this clause because it is not very common. I thought that if I asked them to just find, for example, a non-compete in an employment agreement, there would be way too much information in either source for them to really evaluate which one is better and what the strengths or weaknesses are. So I gave them a clause that is not typically found in an employment agreement. So they would have to work a little bit harder, to be honest, in order to find it. And then after, here are the series of questions for the students to answer. First is to describe how they use the tool. Second, I'm asking them, so they know in advance, to assess about how long it took them to find useful model contract language. I asked them to evaluate both the benefits and the drawbacks of the particular tools that they are using. And then I asked them to evaluate how much work they needed to do to revise the model language that they got in order to meet those best practices, effective drafting techniques. Because I didn't want them to think that regardless of which method they used, they would come out with a response that basically could just be sent to their clients. It still needed work on their part, regardless of whether they used ChatGPT or traditional research methods. The lawyer still needed to use skills in order to draft the clause well. And then at the end of the exercise, we're going to have a discussion evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches. I'm pretty confident that regardless of what set of students and which contract term I ask them to do, that the result will be it's probably best to use both in conjunction. Using ChatGPT to draft this contract clause, of which the students have no knowledge and no experience, the prompt engineering is somewhat difficult. And so it's actually most useful, and hopefully we'll all figure that out together collaboratively at the end of the exercise, if they go on the traditional research tools first, find some model language so they have a sense of what it should look like, what types of provisions should be in this clause, and then they can do a much better job of prompting ChatGPT to get them a result that is more like one that follows the best practices, includes good content, and also is drafted in a way in which I teach them to do so in class. And I will just say, that's the end of my presentation. I'm really interested to hear if other individuals, other professors are using these types of exercises where it's not just the purpose of showing the student how to use ChatGPT or other generative AI, but having them evaluate collaboratively in what way they think it's best to use it in conjunction with other methods of legal research and writing. And I did use ChatGPT to draft. I asked it to draft the final slide of my presentation. And for some reason, I got the pouring of a cup of coffee. I don't know why, but thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. I mean, that's the end of any good conversation, I think, is
a cup of coffee.
So maybe that's it. All right. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Tracy Norton. So go ahead and take it away, Tracy.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for sticking around this long. I know this has been a lot of information. And so we're going to end with, so what can you do with this? Not what do you need to do with your students, but what can you do today with ChatGPT that will make your life easier? And so I have some very good news for you about some things that you can do. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Share that. All right. So I'm going to show you some things that I've done, and I'm going to break these down very quickly into 4 categories: sort of general productivity, some administrative writing tasks that we all have to do that are certainly well within our wheelhouse, but that take us time that we don't necessarily need to spend, including how to use it for letters of recommendation, some things you can do with it for course and assignment design, and then something you can do for scholarship. And then at the end, I'll put in the chat, and Kim can share it with everyone, some resources that I use on a regular basis to help kind of keep me abreast of what's going on with ChatGPT, that literally take me 3 minutes a day to look at. And that's even if I want to look at them. Okay, so I'm going to start with sort of some productivity ideas. My biggest hack for ChatGPT is to ask ChatGPT how it can help. And so I've got just a ChatGPT window up here. I've got ChatGPT 4 up here because I subscribe to OpenAI, but ChatGPT 3.5 does a representative job for this, particularly for things that don't need a lot of reasoning ability. ChatGPT 4 has better reasoning ability, but for what we're going to do, this is going to be perfectly fine, either one. So I'm going to ask it, or I'm going to tell it, I have several, I am a law professor who has 2 scholarly projects to write this summer. Help me devise a schedule to stay on track and produce 2 law review articles by August 15th. Something went wrong. Okay, of course it did. Regenerate the response. There we go. Absolutely, I'd be happy to assist you with the schedule. To ensure you meet your deadline, we'll need to consider various steps. And so it breaks it down for me into pre-writing and research. Tells me May 24th to June 9th, outline June 10th to June 16th, first draft June 17th to July 7th, revision July 8th to July 22nd, finalization 23rd to the 28th. And then project 2, I'm apparently, it's going to overlap them. Pre-writing June 10th to June 25th. Oh, that's a good idea. Okay, I hadn't thought of that. I was going to do them both in tandem. Due to the compressed timeline for the second article, you might need to continue revising and finalizing after August 15th. However, having a solid first draft by this date should put you in a good position. Please adjust as needed. And so I've realized what we all realize over the summer, which is 2 articles was too ambitious, and this is probably a bad idea. But if I do want to keep with my 2 article plan, I've now got a schedule, which is great, because not that I couldn't have come up with a schedule, but this did some things with the schedule that I wouldn't have thought of, the sort of overlap. And it also, made clear to me, okay, this may be a little ambitious to get them both finished by August 15th. So that's the first thing, is anything that I dread doing because I don't quite know how to get started, I now go to ChatGPT right away. Or you can go to any of them. You can go to Claude, you can go to Bard, there are any number of large language models. The fact that it scours the internet and figures out sort of what is the most likely response to something, like what's the most likely word to come after each word, tells me that I'm harnessing sort of the collective wisdom. Now, we usually think of wisdom as being, gears in the brain turning, but the way that words relate to one another is evidence of wheels turning. And so while the wheels don't turn in ChatGPT, it produces something that looks like the product of wheels turning, which sometimes is enough. For this kind of task, that's enough for me to look at it and make some observations about the output. One thing I asked it to do this year, so you can ask it how it can help. One of the things I asked it how to do this year was, and I'm going to see if I can do this. Let me ask. Okay. I'm going to hope everybody can still see this second, this grade sheet that I have up on the screen. I'm going to assume it's going to plan. So I've got a grade rubric up on the screen. Kim, you can't see it? Okay. So stop share, and then I'm going to reshare. Okay. So this is my generic rubric for appellate briefs. This is the one that I redrafted this year for Louisiana State appellate brief. And as I was getting ready to start grading, I thought, God, it would be so nice not to have to deal with all the paper grade sheets and to actually just have an automated brief that I could use instead of like a PDF where I highlight or circle or whatever. And so I decided to go to ChatGPT and see if it could help me come up with a spreadsheet. And so I went to ChatGPT and said, I'd like to create a grading rubric in Google Sheets in which I choose a qualitative option from a drop-down menu, and it equates that to a numerical value that is used to calculate the grade. And so this is, it was a long conversation that I had with ChatGPT to work through the details of that. And you can see here, it started giving me some code and I was like, oh my God. But it actually walked me through very clearly how to use the code. And at one point I said, like I was confused about the code. And so one place I asked it, please tell me which variables I need to replace to make the script work, because I wasn't sure on some of this. And then at one point, like sometimes it'll just stop producing a response. And so you can just tell it, what comes after this thing, it looks like you stopped, and it'll keep going. Can you give me just the part I need to copy for the column width and the row height? So as I was having trouble, kind of making this work, it was talking me through the problems I was having. I said, can I do this in Excel? And it said, yes, you can do the same thing in Excel. And it gave me that information. That turned out to be a little bit more than I was up for. So I went back to the Google Sheets. And after a little bit of time, let me go back to, whoops. Hold on, sorry. I'm having to go back between Chrome and Microsoft Edge. So after a little bit of time, I was able to, I need to get that. This is the rubric script that it gave me. I just pasted this in here and then made the changes it told me to paste. It told me exactly where to go, because at one point I had to type in, I don't know where to put this script. Tell me, like once I open Google Sheets, where do I put this script? And it walked me through exactly where to put it and what to change. And then I ended up with this. So this is my rubric template. And once I got my rubric template, and so you can see, I can choose a qualitative option. I've got the points possible, and then I choose the qualitative option, and it assigns the number of points out of 2 for that particular one. But I didn't want to have to copy this spreadsheet for each student. So I asked it if it could write me a script that I could use to generate a rubric for each student in the class. And it walked me through that. It said, yes, you're gonna write a short spreadsheet that gives a list of the student numbers And these numbers don't correspond to anything. So you couldn't do anything with these numbers if you wanted to. And once I did that and linked it all to the code that it had given me earlier, I clicked execute on the code and it generated 36 spreadsheets, each one with the student number on there already. And then as I graded, I just went through each student's sheet. I decided that at the bottom, I would go ahead and do a OneDrive link for their comments. And so I haven't done this yet, but once students start asking me to review their information, I'm just going to share their spreadsheet with them, which is going to have the link to download the paper, and it's got the rubric, and it's all one-stop shopping. So that was incredibly helpful, and it really did. I would say it saved me as much time in the grading process and in the paper return process as it took me to generate this. And so it's already kind of paid for itself time-wise. So next time I use it, it'll even be better. And now that I have the basic script and the basic spreadsheet, I can adjust this for every rubric that I use. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Then, so as far as productivity, just tell it what you want to do. Tell it where you're stuck at. And if it gives you instructions that are too much for you, say, I didn't understand that. You're going to need to do something more simple for me. And it will accommodate. The next thing I want to suggest is to use it for administrative type writing, particularly where tone is very important. I don't know about you guys, but if there is a political landmine at work that I can step in, that anybody can step in, I will step in it. I'll step in my landmines. I'll step in your landmines. If there's any landmine anywhere, I will step in it. ChatGPT has been a real lifesaver because I can just go there if I've got sort of a tricky conversation coming up, and I can tell it what my concern is. So for example, anything where I'm concerned about tone. At this part of the year, the concern is students unhappy with their grades coming back. They want to tell me it's my fault, even though, it may have been a student who wasn't really tuned in all year. And so I can tell it, please draft talking points for a meeting with a student who is unhappy with his grade. I would like the tone to be sympathetic, but firm and not defensive at all. This student put forth minimal effort throughout the year and only got serious about the work on the last assignment. Okay, so I'm going to ask it what to say. And so now it's going to give me talking points for this conversation. So that's going to alleviate for me some concern about, oh, what do I tell him and how do I structure it, blah, blah, blah. And so acknowledgement of concerns, reiterate that grades are a reflection of a student's understanding, individual performance, last assignment performance, consistency in grading, lessons learned, support and guidance. And that is great. That's, for me, that's about the best I could hope to do with that conversation. Obviously, I'm not in control of how any student reacts, but that strikes the tone I was hoping for. And if it doesn't, I can add to that. I can say, make this a little firmer, or make it more conciliatory, or offer to work with the student over the summer, or suggest future courses for the student. And it'll incorporate that in. And so that takes off a little bit of the burden. Not only does it alleviate a little bit of anxiety about those conversations, but also it takes away that time that I was going to have to plan that. Not that any of us can come up with this before a student meeting, but it's hard to find the time to do that. I also used it for, I also used it to write a letter for, a rec letter for a student that was a different kind of rec letter I'd never written before. And then to help me improve my comments on the appellate brief, because I struggle with just writing the sort of the negative comments. And so I wanted to add in, you know, I wanted the positive and encouraging also. And I really struggled to find the time and the energy to do that. So I said, draft a positive, encouraging comment for the table of contents. Let me know when you're ready for me to tell you what the table of contents requires. So I'm prompting it that I'm going to tell you what a good table of contents looks like. It says I'm ready to receive the specific requirements. And so I tell it what the requirements are. And then it gives me a nice positive comment. And I say, no, I want it briefer than that. So it gives me a briefer comment. Now I'm going to have some variations. Now draft a comment for me that says that the page numbers are missing. Now draft one that points out that the page numbers are aligned on the right margin. Now draft one that points out that the heavy use of bold minimizes the point headings. Now draft one that points out that the heavy use of all caps makes the table hard to read. So I have all these variations. I use annotate by 11 trees for my commenting. So I just put all those into annotate. And then when the specific situation comes up, I just click. And so it took me about, I don't know, 10 minutes to come up with all of these different options. And that made going through the table of contents super, super fast. And it's a place where, as you know, it's a place where you can give some positive feedback, but often, again, I don't necessarily have the time or the energy to draft the nice positive feedback that goes into detail about what's good about it. It made me feel a lot better about grading this spring. So those are some things you can do. Also, this letter of recommendation. I needed to write a letter of recommendation for a teaching assistant looking to get a job as a judicial clerk. I've got tons of letters of recommendation, as we all do, on tap that I can adjust, but I'd never written one for a teaching assistant looking for a judicial clerkship. And so I figured I'll let ChatGPT take the first run at it. And so I did. It was actually very helpful. And I combined this with sort of some language that I like to use in letters of recommendation. And it made that a little bit easier. It was one of those tasks that I was just putting off because, you know, I hadn't done it before. And I was like, oh, I'm going to have to think about it. And so this made it super speedy. And so now, you know, when I have those tasks that I'm putting off, now I'm like, oh, ChatGPT. And now I'm kind of excited about them. Okay. The last big thing is course and assignment design. You can use this for, and teachers all across the world are using it right now. There's a lot of stuff on AI and education and curriculum design. So you can use it for lesson planning. You can use it for classroom hypos. I'll show you that real quick. And you can use it for writing assignments, which is sort of a variation on classroom hypos. So I asked it to draft a lesson. I don't know why I had this in mind specifically, but I did for some reason. Draft a lesson plan to teach ethos, pathos, and logos using the Tom Cruise examination of Jack Nicholson and A Few Good Men, and it popped it right out. Again, not that I couldn't do that, but there are lots of ideas that I have where it's like, oh, I would love to do a class where I do this, but I don't have the time to sit down and plan all of the nifty things I'd like to do. ChatGPT will do them. And it won't maybe be my final plan, but it gives me a starting point, and it's full enough that, you know, it saves me a lot of time. And so I'm able to do a lot of the kind of, ooh, wouldn't it be fun if I could, using ChatGPT. And notice this, it also popped in the YouTube link for the video, which that is as much an impediment to me coming up with a lesson like this as anything. So just having that was incredible. So lesson plans, it's great on. This is one where I fed it a hypo that I use in class for synthesis. And then, and this was where, I mean, ChatGPT really sings. So I gave it the hypo. These are made up cases anyway, so what do I care if it makes up cases? So I told it to make up another hypo based on, first I asked it to draft arguments. What would the defense argue? What would the prosecution argue? Please draft a new synthesis exercise like the one you just solved. Cases can be fictitious. Okay, well, this one came out pretty close to the original one. So I said, this is too much like the original. The new one should focus on whether a weapon is capable of harm, but should have otherwise very different facts and cases. It did pretty good. Write a synthesis exercise where the legal issue is the definition of dwelling under the Texas burglary statute. I have a whole new hypo, whole new law, new made up cases, boom. And so when students come to you and say, I'd like another example to work through, that's one of those where I'm like, well, I only have so many examples and I don't know which ones I want to release. And now I'm just done and dusted, man. And then I ask it, what are the best arguments for prosecution and defense? I get one on New York law. And then I start to really take it all out for a spin. I do a bunch of these hypotheticals. And then I start asking it to produce documents for me. Write an advice letter to the defendant explaining your analysis. Get that? Can you rewrite this paragraph to include in a letter to the opposing attorney? So, and then I tell it, make the tone more aggressive. Then I'm asking it some questions about how much text can you take? Draft a synthesis chart for the first hypothetical set of facts and cases. The one I started with way back at the beginning. It drafts a chart. It does a not bad job of that. Add a row for hypothetical facts, add a column for method of use. Then I say generate one for the burglary hypothetical. I tell it, I want you to include facts, not yes, no answers. I ask it to do one for another hypothetical. Draft another burglary hypothetical. And then later I get it to draft documents that go with it. I have it draft a client interview. I have it draft, oh, here we go. Here's a client interview. Generate a client interview that would establish the hypothetical facts. Then, oh, and then I say, make the transcript seem like an episode of Law and Order. That was very fun. Draft a police report. And then I go, no, I want it in a table. And then I played with it until it started to look, as you see, more like a police report, more like a table. Now that I've trained ChatGPT to do this in this conversation, I'll just come back to this conversation and have it draft more stuff for me. And so now ChatGPT and I are really, really cooking. The fourth thing very quickly is it can really help you with a scholarship logjam. And particularly if you've done the initial research, but you can't, like you're having trouble kind of moving forward. I said kind of based on, you know, what I'm thinking in my article, draft me a law review outline. And it gave me a law review outline and it got me over a huge hurdle I was having. Like I was having a really tough time organizing something. And when I saw the outline, I was like, oh, that's it. That is it. That's how I'm going to organize it. And so it was great help there. So these are just some of the things that you can do with it to help you with just your general productivity, some of those administrative tasks that involve kind of contemplating the tone that we don't always have all the time we would like, course and assignment design, our scholarship. The next thing I'm working on is using Chat PDF or a personal bot to summarize a record into a statement of facts and work with that. I've done some of that with Chat GPT. It's fantastic. I love it. And so in the chat, I'm going to place, let me stop sharing. In the chat, I'm going to, and Kim can place it for everybody. There are two newsletters that I get every day. One is called Superhuman and the other one is called You Probably Need a Robot. And both of them give you like some updates on what's going on with generative AI. It gives you some prompt engineering ideas. So you start to get an idea of how to use these prompts. It has fantastic ideas. And then also, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I follow a lot of people who are doing generative AI in education and generative AI generally. Khan Academy's got some cool stuff right now with a sort of a learning coach that's AI. So lots to do. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope it inspires everybody to get moving.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So we are close to the end of time. And if you've been watching Q&A, the questions have been getting answered via the type. So we'll keep doing that. I launched our closing webinar poll, which looks very similar to our opening webinar poll, because we want to see if any of this has either made you more terrified or has maybe helped you think about how you might use it. So go ahead and fill that out. If people have time to stick around, we can maybe stick around for another 5 minutes or so to answer some of the questions. I know there was a couple of questions that were both aimed at the idea of inputting client information into these different platforms and concerns about that. So I know both Sean and Ashley had responded to that, but I don't know if you wanted to just quickly summarize your thoughts live for folks who didn't see it in the Q&A box.
Sure, I'll jump in, and then I think Sean had some interesting insight into how problems might be ameliorated as newer tech rolls out. But absolutely, the last question. So I told you my two big concerns were about the inaccuracy and how that connects to ethical considerations. Oh, I just realized my video is not on. The inaccuracy and the ethical considerations, and then the client confidentiality and the ethical considerations related to that. So the very last two questions on my worksheet that I showed you with my Connecticut land use statute problem. The second to last was to summarize 1.6, you have to read the rule and the comments. And then the final question was to reflect on how your understanding of the rule may or may not be implicated by using ChatGPT and under what circumstances. So having students realize that they cannot put confidential information. They cannot put any information about their client into ChatGPT. And I also flagged that if you look at the terms of agreement and the FAQs on ChatGPT, which you should look up whenever you're using generative AI, whatever app you're using, it'll tell you that the AI trainers have access to your conversations. They're using it. You're helping them make the bot better and better. So they definitely have access to that. And it tells you not to put any sensitive information on ChatGPT. And the other thing to be mindful of, even if there is a platform that says that the information is private, even if there's a model that's telling you it's protecting your data, it's still vulnerable to data breaches and hacking. So these are all things that we're going to have to grapple with. But I tend to veer on, I veer towards the side of being very cautious.
I think that's completely reasonable, especially in the context of ChatGPT, Claude Plus, like all of those. One of the big selling points of the Westlaw and Lexis ones is that they're completely integrated into the Microsoft suite. So you've got a cybersecurity report from your IT department on all the Microsoft products. You have a cybersecurity report on Lexis and Westlaw. So you shouldn't feel any less confident than you do running searches in those platforms. You know, they both have a brief analyzer that people will, at huge law firms, Kirkland Ellis, the Supreme Court will put stuff into that brief analyzer and feel comfortable. So I think you should feel comfortable once you're in that ecosystem of Microsoft and Lexis and Westlaw, interacting with it in the same way that you do those other products, which is like your email, for example, as an Outlook, probably. You should feel pretty confident. But outside of that, you know, use at your own risk. And I would say, don't put confidential stuff in there.
Great, thank you. Well, I think most of the other questions have now been answered in the Q&A. I know that we are going to continue dealing with this and thinking through this. I know I'm organizing 2 different conferences this summer, and the topics aren't even close to being, well, one of them isn't even close to being AI, storytelling, applied legal storytelling. And we've got some presentations that are thinking about it there. We've got some at our Global Skills Conference. And I know there are several things planned over the summer. So we will continue having these discussions, and we hope to see you at future discussions. And thank you again for coming. We will post this video once everything is kind of uploaded to the website. I will send an email to all of you that came to the webinar, as well as posting it to the listservs. So thank you very much and have a great afternoon.